Blessings. Welcome to today's Law Enforcement Daily Devotional. Today we're continuing in Job and we're in chapter 16 through 19. And we're going to look at these and see what kind of law enforcement takeaway that we can get from it. And I had to read all the way down to Job 19 before I felt really comfortable with a law enforcement takeaway. As I read Job, and I hope as you read Job too, there's a lot of takeaways for my personal life and hopefully for your personal life that may or usually may not be applicable to our job in law enforcement, but they definitely apply to our personal lives, to my life. And there's a lot of takeaways I get daily from those, but we're specifically looking for the law enforcement takeaway. And in 19 verse 7, there's one that seems to crop up more nowadays than ever before in my experience with law enforcement. And I've been in this job for almost 30 years. But that doesn't mean that just because that's my experience that is the truth. That's just my experience. But what I saw today in verse 7, it says, "Behold, I cry out violence, but I get no answer. I shout for help, but there is no justice." I don't think this is as much a law enforcement cry for help as it is for people outside of law enforcement. And a lot of times the injustices they see, the violence that occurs to them, just the situations they find themselves in where they have to call for 911. There's a lot of people hurting and in need who are shouting, "There is no justice." And a lot of times, even as a law enforcement officer, as I look at the law enforcement or the criminal justice system that we have, sometimes when I go to court on a case that's 3 or 4 years old, that's no fault of any of our system. It's just the backlog and the lack of employees to take on these cases and do all this. It's just the world that we live in. So when someone doesn't see a case come to trial for years down the road, you could easily see how they would say, "There's no justice." But you and I both know that just because they don't see an investigator or a detective behind the scenes pulling video or interviewing folks or tracking down things, that doesn't mean the case is not being worked, that it's not being built to a point where it can be handed over to a prosecutor who actually has the decision of whether or not this case goes forward to grand jury or whatever the case may be. So there's always a lot of work behind the scenes. But what we're getting at here is not our criminal justice system at work. This is a cry out to God saying, "God, this violence is happening to me. Where is the justice, Father? Where is your justice?" And we've got to be very careful with this, because a lot of times this makes it seem like we would be better at carrying out justice than God would be, which is total rebellion and sin against God. We don't always see God's plan. We don't always see what God's doing behind the scenes, like what a detective would do. Think of it this way. God knew this injustice was going to happen before it even happened. And before it even happened, God had a plan to deal with it in His justice, in His timing, the way that He sees fit. Just because it doesn't line up with what I want, and we are a very impatient people, and it doesn't line up with my time, doesn't mean that God is not bringing justice. God is a God of justice, and it means a lot to Him. Really neat takeaway. Just a really neat thought. And I wanted to throw this in there. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Sometimes when we feel like we're being unjustly persecuted or oppressed or just being attacked, be still and know that God is in charge. To me, this means sit down, take a deep breath, collect your thoughts. What is God saying? What's God doing? Be still and let Him work. Trust His judgment and His justice. It may not be in my timing, but I trust that it's going to happen. And that is what Job is saying here. And he's in some difficult situations, more so than I think you and I will ever find ourselves in. But then we drop down to verse 25. Even though Job blames God for all the things that are going on in his life and all these horrible circumstances, he says, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. So even in the midst of this injustice, Job knows his Redeemer lives. And in verse 29, Job tells his friends he still looks to God for justice, even though he hasn't seen it. Verse 29, he says, I trust God is still in charge of all judgment, and I trust him. We need that same trust. We need to trust God. We need to be still and be patient and wait on his judgment and justice. Sometimes we don't think it's coming. So tomorrow, read Job 20 through 22, and let's come back here and see what kind of law enforcement takeaways we see in this read. So you guys be very safe, and I'll see you tomorrow.